Living organisms are made up of a number of chemical elements. You're probably familiar with the top five. You have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. But you're probably also aware that those aren't the only elements. There's magnesium and potassium and calcium and sulfur and, well, I think I mentioned sulfur already, but iron and all sorts of elements. The question is, what are they used for? In this video, we'll talk about the chemical requirements of growth. And just a heads up, the information from this video tends to be on an exam. It's usually a fill-in question where I'll ask you what are some of the elements required for growth. And when I say elements, I mean chemical elements like on a periodic table, not uh, factors like temperature and pH and osmotic pressure and different types of atoms. Okay, so elements in this video and on this type of exam question means the elements that are on the periodic table. Let's get started. You have just one objective for this video, and that's to be able to name the four essential elements for microbial growth and describe how microbes obtain these elements and how they are used in cells. This recording is for Bio 239 at Bristol Community College, and so far in lecture we've been talking about all of the requirements that microorganisms have for growth, and you'll recall hopefully from lecture that many of the principles that we're going to talk about are common for all microorganisms, but we are specifically focusing on bacteria. So in lecture we've talked about the physical requirements. We talked about the fact that bacteria are divided up into 5 different categories based upon the temperature range at which they'll grow. We said this range of temperatures could be described in terms of the optimal growth temperature, that is where the growth rate of the bacteria in this case is optimal or fastest. The minimal growth temperature, which is the temperature at which the bacteria grow the slowest, so the rate is the slowest, and then the maximal growth temperature where the rate of growth is the fastest. We also said that bacteria like to live at a pH of about 6.5 to about 7.5, so that's roughly physiological pH. The range of pHs for your average bacterium is a little bit more acidic than we find in the human body, but it's somewhat similar. And we said that osmotic pressure is also important. And remember that for osmotic pressure, we talked about the fact that bacteria are almost always in a hypotonic environment, which means that the tendency is for water to flow into the bacterial cell, causing swelling. And if it wasn't for the cell wall of the bacterium, those bacteria would likely burst. And certain antibiotics like penicillin take advantage of this by weakening the cell wall and making bacteria more susceptible to death via osmotic lysis. Now, in this recording, we want to look at the chemical requirements for growth. Bacteria, fungi, whatever microorganisms outside of viruses that we want to consider, they're all living organisms. That means that they need proteins, they need carbohydrates, they need lipids, and they need nucleic acids in order to live. Well, if you remember back to your college level biology course where you examined these macromolecules, you'll remember that carbon is a major component of pretty much all of the biologically relevant molecules that we tend to study. You'll also remember that nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus are also very important. In addition to these elements, you have trace elements that are important. Oxygen is important, and then of course there are organic growth factors, that is like vitamins, that are also involved in promoting the growth of microbes. So when we talk about chemical requirements, we're really talking about those elements that you find on the periodic table. So although there are over 100 different elements on the periodic table, it's important to know that really only a small fraction of them are important for sustaining the growth of microorganisms, and we want to consider just a handful of those elements in this recording. Now, I do want to caution you that we're not going to consider many of the, I won't say less important, but many of the elements that are required, but in very small amounts. So you can look to other references for that kind of information, but we're going to consider kind of the major elements. So let's start with carbon. Carbon is element number 6 on the periodic table, and it is incredibly important. You cannot have a living organism without carbon. Okay, remember that living organisms are organic, and one of the definitions of being organic is containing carbon. That's just one of the definitions. Remember why carbon is important. Back in your college level biology, you probably looked at the structure of lipids, nucleic acids, proteins, and carbohydrates. And one element that was common to all of them was carbon. Okay, you can't have these macromolecules without carbon. So carbon is actually half of the dry weight of bacterium. And the bacteria use carbon as a structural component of a lot of organic molecules. So for example, remember DNA consists of a nitrogen containing base, and that nitrogen containing base has carbon in it. You have, if we're talking about DNA, deoxyribose. Well, deoxyribose has carbon in it. Okay. If you consider proteins, proteins have a backbone that is made up of carbon. Okay, so carbon is an important structural component of organic molecules. Carbon is also used as an energy source. So if you look at ATP, it contains carbon. If you look at glucose, that's C6H12O6, it has carbon. If you look at lipids, lipids are basically a glycerol containing backbone with hydrocarbons attached. Well, hydrocarbons are part hydrogen and part carbon. So you have to have carbon in order to make lipids, okay, which can be broken down for energy. Now remember, when we talk about living organisms, we can divide them up into two groups. You have your autotrophs and you have your heterotrophs. Okay, heterotrophs must get their nutrients and their energy from outside of themselves, from outside of their cells. Autotrophs make their own energy using photosynthesis or some other chemical process. So chemoheterotrophs are basically those organisms that are going to absorb chemicals from the environment around them, and they're going to use those in part as a source of energy. Typically, your chemoheterotrophs get organic carbon through absorbing proteins or amino acids, lipids, or carbohydrates from their environment. Autotrophs get their carbon from carbon dioxide. And then again, through photosynthesis, they convert that carbon dioxide into glucose or some other carbohydrate. Nitrogen is next. It is also incredibly important for living organisms. You cannot have proteins unless you have nitrogen. Okay, remember nitrogen is a part of amino acids, and proteins are made up of amino acids. So you have to have nitrogen. In addition to being a component of proteins and amino acids, nitrogen is also part of your nitrogen-containing bases like adenine, cytosine, thymine, and guanine, which we find in DNA. Remember, RNA also has nitrogen-containing bases. This includes uracil, which is unique to RNA. ATP, the chemical energy of the cell, it's basically an RNA base, okay, adenine, but it has a couple of extra phosphates attached. So, as a nitrogen-containing base, ATP also has nitrogen in it. Now, in order to get nitrogen, most bacteria are going to decompose proteins, so they may secrete enzymes to the environment, and then those enzymes break down proteins in the environment, and the bacteria absorb the breakdown products. Okay, and they get their nitrogen that way. Some bacteria may use nitrate, or they may use ammonium. A few bacteria, like your cyanobacteria, are capable of nitrogen fixation, so that means they absorb nitrogen gas from the atmosphere and then they convert it into another chemical compound. Sulfur is important. Sulfur is a component of two essential amino acids, methionine and cysteine. So remember that methionine for a lot of living organisms is the first amino acid at the beginning of protein synthesis. This is not for all living organisms, but for many. Cysteine is important because it helps to reinforce the three-dimensional shape, aka the three-dimensional conformation of proteins. In addition, you find sulfur in certain B vitamins like biotin and thiamine. So living organisms need sulfur. Most bacteria are going to get their sulfur from decomposing proteins that have sulfur in them, okay, as cysteine or methionine, or they may absorb sulfate ions from the environment, or they may get it from hydrogen sulfide. Phosphorus is another element incredibly important in living organisms. We find phosphorus as a component of DNA, RNA, and ATP. It's also incorporated into phospholipids, which are the major lipid in the membranes of living organisms. Microbes may get their phosphorus from breaking down nucleic acids in the environment. They may also get it as part of a phosphate ion that they absorb from the environment. Living organisms could not exist, though, without phosphorus, generally speaking. Now, these aren't the only elements that are required for microbial growth. There are other elements like iron, which is incredibly important, especially for a lot of organisms that carry out aerobic cellular respiration. Iron is involved in the redox reactions of the electron transport chain. Organisms typically need magnesium, potassium, and calcium. These act as cofactors. So remember, a cofactor is an ion that binds a protein, and it is required for the proper function of that protein. We have trace elements that are required in small amounts for living organisms. Usually these are also serving as enzyme cofactors. In the lab, we don't really worry about these trace elements when we're making media to grow microorganisms. We kind of assume they're in distilled water or in tap water. Organic growth factors are going to be organic compounds that are obtained from the environment and used to support growth. Things like vitamins or amino acids, purines or pyrimidines. Your purines and pyrimidines are basically nucleotides. So I know this was a short video, but during this video I've given you the 4 essential elements for microbial growth. And of course you know that there are more than 4 elements that are essential. It's just we highlighted 4 here. So the 4 were carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. And I can tell you're thinking, what about oxygen? Well, it turns out that oxygen isn't essential for all microorganisms. In my next video, we'll talk about oxygen requirements and why some microorganisms require oxygen, but others don't. For now, you want to make sure that you remember the essential 4 elements that were mentioned in this video, how microbes obtain them, and how they're used in cells, because as I mentioned at the top of this video, this is usually an exam question, hint, hint. You'll need to be able to come up with the 4 elements from your memory as well as how they are used in cells. Now, if you have a few minutes, I have a few review questions coming up after the break. If you don't have time, then I'll see you at the next video. As always, don't be afraid to reach out with questions during office hours, by email, or by text. I'll see you at the next video. How about some review questions? Here's your first one. Which of the following shows the growth of bacterial cells in the absence of carbon? Would it be A, where there's lots of growth, B, where there's some growth, it's kind of moderate growth, or C, where there's little or no growth? Right, the answer is C. Carbon is an essential element for making proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. Without carbon in the cell, you can't make any of these things, so there'd be no growth. Phosphorus is necessary for making which of the following? Amino acids, carbohydrates, or nucleic acids? You might need to pause the video, and when you're ready, press play to hear the answer. Yes, nucleic acids. That's the right answer. I'm sure you remembered the sugar phosphate backbone of DNA, RNA, and maybe you remembered the phosphate that's on ATP. Now, although ATP isn't a nucleic acid, it's very similar in structure to RNA. Sulfur is essential for making which of the following? Would that be amino acids, carbohydrates, or nucleic acids? Amino acids. Cysteine and methionine are your two amino acids that require sulfur. Most importantly, cysteine is important in reinforcing protein structure. So without sulfur, you'd have denatured proteins floating around in the cell, and they aren't good for anything. Last one, heterotrophs get their carbon by, would it be absorbing proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids from their environment? Or absorbing carbon dioxide? Or they don't need carbon? So this is not a valid question. What do you think? Right. Heterotrophs are organisms that don't make their own energy. They have to absorb it from their environment. And they absorb it in the form of proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids, which they then break down into smaller components, releasing energy that gets stored in ATP. Great job!